Well, we're excited that you've joined us this morning to listen to the presentation and give us your comments on the drainage ordinance. I've got Barry Lodge here with me in the conference room, and Michelle January is online. The meeting protocol, we just want to have you please mute your microphone, use chat to ask questions, and raise your hand and we'll call on you. We will have a question and answer period at the end of the presentation, or if you have something right then, go ahead and raise your hand. I've got my iPad set up so I should be able to see that. What we're going to go over today is the new drainage ordinance that we've revised, and we are putting in place an Oklahoma City Drainage Criteria Manual that's been in the works for about 10 years. Both documents can be found at okc.gov/publicworks. We have also put up there a summary of the proposed revisions so that you can kind of do a comparison of what has changed. Here are the two documents that we're going to discuss today. A little history here. The current ordinance was developed back in 1970 as Chapter 15A, and since 1981 to 2020, we have had 15 map updates. Well, not necessarily map updates, but 15 updates to the drainage ordinance, but then also have periodic updates to the FEMA maps, which are included in the ordinance. This was made part of the city code in 1970. And the needs for the revisions, we need to address the inconsistencies with Chapter 16, revise the definitions to be more consistent with FEMA. We need to remove the drainage design criteria from Chapter 16, and that is why we've created the Drainage Criteria Manual for the design requirements. And we're revising drainage design criteria to address our current and future flooding issues. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to Barry. He'll give a brief presentation about the changes.
Good morning, everyone. Barry Lodge with the City of Oklahoma City Public Works. I'm going to go through the major changes that we're proposing for the new drainage ordinance and the drainage criteria manual. If any of you were in the meeting last week, a lot of this will be repeat, but hopefully it'll help us all get on the same page with this as well. We have received quite a number of comments and questions online. Some of you will ask questions. We'll have time for question and answer during this meeting, but I would still ask that any questions that you have, that you go ahead and use the form that is on the website and submit those to the PW Drainage so that we'll have a written record of your questions as well. Major items we're going to talk about today that are changed in the ordinance or have been updated will be detention, the open drainage channels, which the drainage criteria manual being a new document, our storm sewer system design criteria. We're going to talk quite a bit probably about public versus private storm sewer systems, and then some changes in our floodplain activity permit requirements. I want to start with the revisions that we're looking at on the city detention requirements, and I'm going to start at the bottom of this slide and work my way up these bullet points. One of the biggest changes that we're making on the detention requirements are going to be the change to require a multi-frequency outlet structure design. Currently, the ordinance is written such that we only require detention to be provided for the 100-year storm. We are now going to move into the multi-frequency outlet structure design for the 2 through the 100-year storm events. We have previously had a provision for a fee in lieu of detention in certain requirements, and consultants that are on the call are probably familiar with that process. With the new ordinance and the new criteria manual, we are going to remove that provision for a fee in lieu of detention. Instead, we will go to a provision for a waiver of the on-site detention requirements if certain criteria are met. So this will put it'll put it all back on the engineers and the developers to come up with the calculations to show that the waiver should be granted. Waivers will be considered to the on-site detention requirement generally if the site drains to a public street or storm sewer system or discharges directly to a creek or a river channel. One of the items that would probably exclude a site from a waiver will be if your site discharges onto an adjacent property. So keep that in mind as when you're looking at your detention design and develop for your new developments. On our drainage channels, the major change on our open drainage channels is going to be that these channels will be required to be designed to convey runoff from a 100-year storm event. Currently, that design criteria is at the 50-year storm. We feel that it is going to be beneficial for the public to increase that to the 100-year storm event. The exception to that would be generally in an area that has a natural channel that can go through a common area or an easement that may not be able to be improved due to blue line requirements from the Corps of Engineers. The requirement then would be that whatever land would be inundated by the extent of the 100-year storm event would have to be contained within an or a common area. And that would remain as the maintenance responsibility of the property owners, homeowners association. I want to add one more thing back on this slide. We didn't have it on the slide, but it did come up in some of the questions last week, and that was concerning bridge and culvert design criteria. So I thought I'd address that a little bit here too. For our culverts, the requirement's essentially going to be the same as it has been for a number of years, that all of the culverts will be required to convey the 50-year storm with no more than 1 foot of head at the entrance to the culvert. The additional criteria of that would be that the Q100 storm event would not overtop the roadway. For bridges, we would have the requirement that the Q50 will be below the low chord of the bridge, and again, that the Q100 does not overtop the roadway. Drainage criteria manual. Storm sewer design requirements were previously published in the drainage ordinance. They were part of that ordinance, and we're removing all of the drainage design criteria from the ordinance, putting that in a separate manual. This document, the drainage criteria manual, will be presented as a reference to the drainage ordinance, so it is considered part of the ordinance. One of the major differences, though, is that if we need to make revisions to this manual, which we will at various times in the future, that document can be approved by our city engineer, public works director, without having to go to city council for express approval. And our plan is that we will post those, any revisions to that on the city website for a minimum of 60 days before becoming effective. So we're going to be looking at possible revisions to this manual just as an ongoing process as we update all of these manuals. Storm sewer systems. Currently, the design requirement is for the storm sewer systems to be designed for the 10-year storm event. We are upgrading that to require storm sewer systems to be designed for the 25-year storm. The requirement that's in place now is that the streets be handled the 25-year storm without overtopping the curbs. That will still be a requirement. The changes, we'll have to pick up the 25-year storm instead of the 10 at that point. Probably the next major change that we've written into the new ordinance and the drainage criteria manual concerns public versus private storm sewer systems. And there's been a lot of discussion and a lot of questions about this issue going both ways, both pro and con, that private storm sewer systems should be inspected and approved by the city, and then we get the opposite argument. Currently, in the ordinance and the criteria manual, we have the statement that if all of the drainage or runoff is generated by a certain development site, so all that runoff comes from your development site, the storm sewer system would be private and maintained by the property owner. We had a good question last week concerning that. We had just some brief discussions. So we're looking at probably revising this, just due to the fact that we really can't have private storm systems within a public right-of-way. So the revision we're looking at where we've talked about making, and it's going to be under discussion probably for the next several days, is that if you have public streets, your storm sewer system would be public. If you have private streets, your storm sewer system would be private, would be maintained by the property owner or property owners, homeowners associations. The process that we're trying to put in place now as part of the new ordinance and criteria manual is that if we have a private storm sewer system, they will not be submitted to Public Works Engineering for review and approval. In addition, we would not have Public Works inspectors that would be providing the construction inspection on those systems. Those plans for private storm sewer systems would be submitted to development services. They would review the plans, and all of the inspections would be provided by their inspectors in accordance with the plumbing code. And I'm sure there'll be some questions that come up on that part of it. Public storm sewer systems, they will be required to be provided by the development when an off-site drainage area of greater than 6 acres enters your development site. Regardless of where it comes from, if it is larger than 6 acres, that would require a public storm sewer system. They'll also be required to provide a public system if there is an existing storm sewer system, whether that be a public or a private system that discharges onto your development site. And these, as has been the process for years, would be submitted to and reviewed by Public Works Engineering for approval, inspected by the city inspectors as well. I brought this up in the meeting last week, and one thing that we've noticed over the past is that some of the storm sewer systems, there's been question about whether they've actually been dedicated to the city for future maintenance. I would encourage you to put onto your plats, other documents, notes where these are expressly dedicated to the city for maintenance purposes of your new the drainage infrastructure. Got a lot of questions coming up about that in the past, or have come up in the past, about that issue. And so that's something that we're going to be looking for, and something I'd like for you guys to be paying particular attention to as well. One other item we have received questions on concerning floodplain activity permits. Currently, the requirement is that a FEMA elevation certificate is required for any structure that is constructed within the limits of a FEMA map floodplain and or within 200 feet of the limits of that FEMA map floodplain. The revision to this will be that if your building structure falls outside of the mapped FEMA floodplain, but is still within 200 feet, you would no longer have to provide a FEMA elevation certificate. A surveyor certificate would be required to verify that the structure meets the established minimum finished floor elevation. If your building structure falls within the limits of the mapped floodplain, you would still be required to provide a FEMA elevation certificate, and that's documentation that we are required to have on hand when FEMA comes and does their periodic inspections. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Debbie and let her talk a little bit about this.
Well, we would like to open it up for questions and comments that you may have about our proposed changes. So if you'd like to raise your hand, I'm not sure if I can see how to get to the chat, but if you'll raise your hand, I will. I
can't raise my hand. I'm on a phone, but could I ask a question or two?
May I ask who this is?
Yeah, this is Paul Odom. I'm a real estate developer. We've been in business for about as long as the city has been existing.
And what's your questions?
Okay, I've got two of them. One of them is, obviously there's a lot of changes here, and what is the reason for all of these changes?
Well, the reason we're going through and making these changes is we're trying to, we need to take out some of the inconsistencies in the Chapter 16. We want to revise those definitions. We're removing the drainage design information from the ordinance and placing it into the criteria manual. And we want to revise some of the requirements to address some of our current flooding issues that we're seeing.
And Paul, this is Eric Winger. I think one of the things I forgot to mention when I introduced the meeting, I want to thank both Tim Johnson with Johnson & Associates and Brian Mitchell with Smith Roberts Bollischweiler that are on the call with us today. The city reached out to both of them to assist the city staff in working through some of the required changes. I think as Debbie outlined, there's a number of items with the ordinance just having not been updated in some time. A lot of the calculation methodologies need to be updated, which are going to be in the drainage criteria manual. And we've had some requested changes from FEMA, especially to align with their new definitions. And then most importantly, what Debbie mentioned was we're finding just a lot of flooding conditions in Oklahoma City that can be better addressed through better designs, and the changes in the ordinance will help us do that. But with both Tim and Brian on call today too, I just wanted to again extend our appreciation for their assistance and helping us just to make sure that we're not going to be over requiring what we should be looking at in Oklahoma City. And the changes that are being proposed also are not in excess of what's in surrounding communities. We've been a little bit behind in getting our ordinances updated, but we're just bringing them up and modernizing them the best that we can.
Okay, thank you. The additional question I have is that has a cost analysis been done with your proposed new ordinance versus an old ordinance on a typical, let's say, quarter section of property for a residential developer, and then in addition for a commercial developer, let's say a 10-acre site versus a 10-acre site and then maybe a smaller site? Because I think it's very important that everybody knows that what these changes are going to be. So has that been done?
Oh, this is Eric Winger again. So we have not run a cost analysis. It would be a little bit difficult for us to determine that, not knowing what the exact development may be. I believe that there's a lot of developments that won't see any difference in cost. There are others that see a marginal increase in cost, but I think from an engineering standpoint and the new requirements and what we're asking for, there are going to be outlet structures to detention pond requirements that require a multi-frequency outlet. There's probably an incremental increase in cost for that outlet, but I don't think it's significant. It's also something that's being done in, say, Norman and Edmond to help reduce a lot of their flooding concerns in those communities as well. The single outlet structure. We are going to be requiring a slightly higher storm frequency for certain designs just to make sure that some of the pipe sizes are properly sized for Oklahoma storms. So there could be some increase in cost based on pipe that, as we both know, pipe is not always the solution. There's other alternatives to pipe, whether it be open channel, other design solutions, and it's going to really be a function of the engineering and just depending on what the individual consulting engineer provides as a design solution. So I wish I could give you a number, but we have not run an analysis on a quarter section or a half section.
Okay, well, Eric, I think that is something very necessary for the development community and the city to get their arms around. So I would respectfully request you have 2 engineering consultants. They can take one of their typical areas in commercial and residential and not too difficult, do a cost analysis, because just to say, oh, we're going to do this and we don't know, that's very difficult for our city to swallow when we don't know these costs. So I would request that happen. Could you affect that, Eric?
Let me visit with our consultants. I mean, absolutely, we'll definitely respond to the question, Paul.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay. Alan?
Yes, this is Alan Dennis with the Garber. One question that I had when reading through the ordinance was how much of this was taken, or how much was the community rating system for FEMA's NFIP taken into account when drafting these ordinances?
Alan, appreciate the question. I saw your email submitted question concerning that a few minutes before we started the meeting. We really didn't look at the ordinance specifically how it would affect our CRS rating. We are cognizant of that, so we're looking at that in some of the things that will be submitted, but really our primary focus was more on how we could best address the flooding situations that we're seeing around the city. That's really our primary concern. CRS is a big part of what we're doing. It's an important program, and we are continuing to work on that, but that was not a primary consideration in the revisions that we made to the ordinance.
Okay, thanks for your answer.
Certainly.
Mr. Farha? Clay, did you have a question? Okay, we'll go ahead and move on to Blaine Sheffield.
Well, I want to go back to the public and private storm sewer, because Barry said it a while ago before I could ask the question, but if it's going to be private streets and private storm sewer for a subdivision, would the drainage not go to Public Works to be reviewed?
No, the process that we're proposing on it right now is that if it is a private system, that storm drainage would be reviewed and approved in development services.
But that even for a residential subdivision, I can understand the commercial because they're two different.
Not public, no.
Yeah, Blaine, that's something we may need to look at.
But Blaine, I think to answer, I mean, for a traditional subdivision, a public subdivision in Oklahoma City, those systems are still going to be reviewed by Public Works as they always have been. So it's really strictly related to private developments and potentially future private subdivisions.
Okay.
Which there's not very many.
That's true. I got a couple of other quick things because I've got several things I'll email down there, but one of the things I looked at and saw through the criteria manual and the ordinance is the HP storm pipe not going to be allowed?
No, it's going to be allowed. We're still in our trial period of one of our projects of having it underneath the roadway, but it's allowed anywhere else outside of the roadway. And that's public roadway. So if it's a parking lot, you can put it underneath that.
And I saw where it looks like the graded street inlets are going to be allowed again.
No, they're still excluded from new development. The only time that they would be allowed would kind of in line with what the current policy is that in an existing development where that really winds up being the only way to solve a flooding issue,
Right.
then street ends would be allowed, but not in new construction.
And the last one I'll ask, in 16.6, it was talking about no grading or anything was going to be allowed until all the permits and all that were obtained. Does that mean that no grading or anything can be done on the site until the plans are approved, or is it like the old ways where plans were reviewed and everything looked okay, then grading was still going to be allowed to take place?
We can look into that a little further. If I'm looking in section 16.6 in the ordinance now, and that is in reference to primary drainage channels.
Right.
And so in that instance, where if we've got anything going on in one of the primary drainage channels, then yes, all of the permits would have to be in place prior to any work being done, because that would involve Corps of Engineers permits, could potentially involve FEMA permits as well.
Right.
And so in those situations, yes, it would. That would not necessarily apply to on-site grading for a residential development, that kind of thing, where the channels and other permits were not required.
Okay. Well, I'm glad to finally see this thing getting close to being approved after the work that we did on it years ago. So.
Hey, Blaine,
Absolutely.
this is Michelle. Hey, this is Michelle January, Blaine. I would like to add a few comments to your questions, if I may.
Sure.
On the HP, it is allowed behind curb. It is not allowed yet for under public street.
Okay.
So that hopefully that would clarify your question. And on the private storm sewer, so right now, for any private street in the subdivision, we do not allow public storm sewer. It will have to be private storm sewer if there is a private street. However, there are some subdivision that has different phases and already have a HOA ordinance in place. So, and then the private storm sewer is not part of the HOA ordinance. So on some of those that already has a few phases built in, we do allow private street with public storm sewer. So there are a little bit exception in there. And in this criteria that we're talking about, we're mainly focusing on the commercial development for private storm sewer.
Right.
We may need to clarify a little bit more, thank you for the concern. We may need to clarify a little bit more in our verbiage if the private storm sewer in the private street of the subdivision requires inspection from field services, public works, or development services. So we can clarify that.
Yeah, I just remember that it was always questions came up about it, and it was always a little confusing. So
sure. And if you don't mind, if you have time, if you can, jot down the questions so that we can have it documented, and we will make sure we will address those comments that you have.
Oh, well, I've got several little nitpicky things that I don't need to ask right now, so I'll just put them in an email and send them down there.
Sure. Thank you, Blaine.
All righty. Thanks.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have a question? I don't see a
Usually has to play again. He's trying to maybe get his hand. He's muted.
Clay, did you have a question that you'd like to ask?
Yeah, but can you guys hear me? I'm muted.
I can hear you now.
You can? Okay, great. Well, yeah, I do. Since I'm having trouble. These are more comments and questions. Again, you can hear me, correct?
Yes.
Okay, all right. I'll make this quick. I know you guys are trying to mitigate flooding situations, but it just seems to me that it's too general. It should, in my opinion, it should be site specific. You can't mitigate all contingencies, versus, now we're going to 25-year. I mean, everything in life, there's risk. I mean, and I'm being silly here, but you'll get my point. I mean, we can't mitigate a meteor strike. I mean, you can't mitigate everything. It just seems like it's overkill. It's too general. Again, I think it should be site specific. I think there's problems up there at Penn Memorial, I understand, but I don't think it should apply to other areas that don't have flooding problems. We're going to have ugly concrete weirs. I mean, it's just going to be concrete. And we have a site in Midtown that it's impervious. And why we can't use a fee in lieu of it, it doesn't seem fair. It's more cost to us. It's not only more cost, it's more paperwork. We want the city to grow, and I just think that this is somewhat punitive. And I'm gonna go mute now. Thank you.
This is Eric Winger. We want to be really conscious about making sure that we don't put undue time or cost on future developments in Oklahoma City. And I think one of the things that we introduced when we began was, we're beginning to just see a lot of new flooding and increased flooding potential across the city as it develops. We're finding the older ordinance just simply did not forecast all of the things that Oklahoma City has become, and even the surrounding communities as well. The changes that we're proposing are incremental. There's been a lot of discussions also at the Planning Commission about trying to address flooding issues citywide, and we would agree you can't mitigate all flooding, but we are trying to make sure that we put our best foot forward and do our best to address some of the increased flooding that is occurring. But there's always going to be that ability for the exception to detention. So if through engineering analysis under the new ordinance, it can be shown that the detention does not improve the site condition, staff's going to review that, and there is an exception rule in the ordinance to not require the detention in those cases. But for the others, we do want to modernize the ordinance. Again, we used consultants to help us make sure that we weren't doing something that was more than maybe other communities were already doing, but also where they've also put their best foot forward. So the comments are greatly appreciated. I think Paul Odom asked some good questions earlier too about cost, and let us run that analysis, and we'll get that responded to so that we can see what that incremental cost may be.
Okay, Dirk Hudson has his hand raised. Did you have a question?
Yes, I did. I appreciate that very much. I did want to follow up on a question that was asked by Blaine regarding the HP storm pipe. Debbie responded that there's a trial project that's in process that Oklahoma City is still reviewing or observing. I believe the project she's referencing is Kelly Avenue widening project, which there's numerous phases of, with crossroad pipes used with that polypropylene pipe. This was installed well over 2 years ago and was successfully cameraed a year after installation. My first part of that question is, what is the review process on when the comfortability of that pipe is shown based on the video, and also based on the performance outside of the bond period by Oklahoma City? And then the other portion is with Blaine, or within their cost savings analysis, that discussion in the residential streets that do follow under that public infrastructure. There's substantial cost savings that numerous municipalities and DOTs have received by allowing this pipe as an option. And wouldn't it make sense for the option to still remain with the engineer like it's been in the past on these widening projects, that it should be written into the DCM, but just the option be up to that engineer to go about their due diligence and their engineering expertise to see if that cost savings is relevant on their project?
This is Eric Winger. I think those are great comments, and we definitely want to be open in Oklahoma City to new products and new opportunities, and especially those that could potentially save cost. Our review, we don't have a set criteria for a time frame, but we are actively looking at that. And I know there's been a number of questions in the last few weeks raised about the HP pipe. So I wish I could give you a timeline on that. I don't have that to offer today, but we are working to see what our next steps and what we can advise on that. But I think to answer the last question, the reason it's so important for Oklahoma City to review these is that ultimately, once that pipe is put into the public right-of-way, it becomes a pipe owned by the city of Oklahoma City. And it's one that the city has to maintain and make sure that it stays in proper working conditions. So as much as we do rely on the engineers for good designs, and we will always do that, we just need to make sure that it's something that the city can address for a long-term maintenance and lifetime cost. So I appreciate your patience with the HP pipe approval. Like Michelle mentioned, it is approved to be placed anytime it's behind curb. We just don't currently allow it under pavement. So it is a product that we can move forward on now, just not under pavements. But once that is reviewed, we can maybe make that change too.
Thank you.
Tim, did you have a question or comment? Tim Johnson?
Yeah, I just wanted to interject on that that would not impact either the ordinance or the DCM. That would be something that would be a white book specification amendment.
Okay, thank you.
Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, I think in the DCM, we may talk about different pipe materials, and if HP was left out, it wasn't intentional. So that's something we're going to go back and look at.
Yeah, I think the DCM does mention the HP pipe being allowed behind the curbs, but not into the streets. But again, that's more of an administrative revision if we need to modify that.
Jim Parrick, you have a question?
Hey, Debbie. Yeah, could you and Eric talk a little bit about the requirement for retention on site downtown? It seems that would be cost prohibitive in many instances, and in some cases just darn near impossible. And so could you give a little color on it?
Jim, this is Eric. I'm happy to respond. I think as we look at the redevelopment of the downtown area, I think we would concur. There's a lot of urbanized area that has no room for adding detention, and that's something that we're going to have to take into full consideration when that occurs. But we're also seeing in a lot of opportunities, and I'll just use some of, say, like the new MAPS 3 projects, the convention center, the new Scissortail Park, perhaps some of the new larger developments like the Omni Hotel, where we're actually getting into raising complete sites, where there is that opportunity potentially on new developments, even in the downtown area, that detention needs to be considered. So this ordinance is really geared towards that. Is to make sure that we're taking our best foot forward and looking to see if detention can be provided, that it be required. But agreeably, especially on a lot of the smaller sites that are being redeveloped, we know that that's going to be a challenge, and we'll work with the engineers on the exclusion clause on those when it just can't be provided at all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have a question? I'm not seeing any hands raised.
Hey, Debbie, I know in the chat I have been responding to Gary Huran. I'm sorry.
Yes,
Question on the floodplain activity permit. If we would like to clarify that a little bit, I think something that it may be some confusion on the slide.
Okay. Go and look at his question. He did ask a question about why require multi-frequency storm events, and Michelle had answered because there are times when you provide detention just for the 100-year storm, you have flooding issues on the lower storms. So this way we can address the smaller frequencies and help prevent the flooding, because a lot of our complaints that we receive are on the 2 or 5 year storms. And then Gary also asked, does the 200 feet apply to both FEMA map, Zone A and AE? And Michelle answered, that's correct. Any activities within 200 feet require a floodplain activity permit. Let's see. Michelle, you might want to clarify what else here.
I think Gary may have just raised his hand.
Okay, thank you. I have to go back and forth. Hi, Gary, would you like to ask a question?
I was just asking about the 200 foot. It sounds like you were moving the survey certificate for a building within 200 feet of the FEMA zone. Is that correct?
Yes, you will only have to have an elevation certificate if your building is within the FEMA floodplain shown on the maps. If you're outside of that, you can just provide a surveyor certificate.
Just say, might change that to ones that have been studied versus Zone A. You might want to still require that certificate for Zone A because those are just done by approximate methodologies.
Yeah, and if you do have a site that's adjacent to a Zone A, there would have to be a finished floor established there, but that would fall under in the criteria of just a surveyor certificate rather than the FEMA elevation certificate being required in that instance.
Since you don't have an established floodplain and floodway.
Right.
Okay, anyone else have a question? Going once? Twice?
Hello, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, well, this is Paul Odom. I have to jump off, but I appreciate everybody's willing to work through these issues, and Eric and Debbie and everybody trying to make our city a better place. We just want to make it very smart and going with a new ordinance with our eyes wide open. So I appreciate everybody's willingness to study all the issues. And so I've got to jump off, and have a great weekend, everybody.
Okay, you too.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have a question? Well, our next steps for moving forward, we have our meeting today, which is our second public outreach to receive comments. Continue going through the documents. We do have a PDF file for you to place your comments on.
Oh, yes. Yes. There is a form on the website. There's a fillable PDF form on there that you can submit your comments on. It has lines on there so that you can put the section of the ordinance or the criteria manual that you're referring to, as well as your comment. We'd appreciate it if you use that.
It'll help us keep everything consistent. So if you still have comments or you find something, you have another question, go ahead and submit that. And we'll need all of your comments and revisions by March the 5th. We're going to have all of our responses to the comments that we'll go through by March 26th. And we would like to introduce this to City Council on April 27th, have a public hearing on May the 11th, and have it approved on May 25th by City Council. And then the ordinance would go into effect 30 days after that. So, and that's just our schedule that we have set out. if we need to change that, we'll make sure we put that out on the website.
Well, again, I appreciate everybody participating this morning on our call. Be sure to use the comment form as suggested, and again. Oh, is there a question? No?
Hey, Eric, this is Michelle. There was a question asked during the first meeting for the PDH certificate. So I just want to remind everybody that we do give out the 1 hour PDH. If you can just request it through the pwdrainage@okc.gov, then we can have one prepared and email it back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. I appreciate you letting everybody know that. We'll take care of those. So if there's nothing else, again, thank you, everybody. Thank you again to Tim Johnson and Brian Mitchell for being on call and helping us with some of the Q&A today. And thanks to all the staff. So everybody have a good Friday and a good week. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.